From the southeastern corner of western North Carolina, this is Folklore. I'm your host, James Hernician. This podcast began 2 years ago with a 3-part series on education, in large part because I thought then, and still do, that the one thing that almost everyone in this county can take pride in is our top-ranked schools. And that seemed to be a good place to begin laying the foundation of a platform for conversations that are so hard to have in this polarized and politicized era. It's time for another education-themed episode. In a moment, you're going to hear from Loti Woods and Dale Weiler, who run a nonprofit organization from their home in Lynn called Champions for Wildlife. They use art to inspire children to take an interest in our natural world and the animals that share it. But first, here's a couple of quotes that explain just why I wanted to talk with them. The first one comes from the late great astronomer and science communicator Carl Sagan, writing in his last book, The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. Every now and then, I'm lucky enough to teach a kindergarten or first grade class. Many of these children are natural-born scientists, although heavy on the wonder side and light on skepticism. They're curious, intellectually vigorous, provocative, and insightful questions bubble out of them. They exhibit enormous enthusiasm. I'm asked follow-up questions. They've never heard of the notion of a dumb question. But when I talk to high school seniors, I find something different. They memorize facts. By and large, though, the joy of discovery, the life behind those facts, has gone out of them. They've lost much of the wonder and gained very little skepticism. A fair bit before Sagan, the British philosopher Bertrand Russell put it even more bluntly in his 1957 essay, How to Read and Understand History. Most children wish to know things until they go to school. In many cases, it is bad teaching that makes them stupid and uninquiring. In other words, sometimes schools can be an impediment to learning. Often this is due to competing priorities, limited budgets, and maybe some difficult parents. Whatever the reason, Champions for Wildlife is, in my humble opinion, exactly what the doctor ordered. We talked in Loti and Dale's backyard, and if you listen closely, you'll hear some of the native wildlife chime in. Loti Woods and Dale Weiler, welcome to Folklore.
Nice to be here.
Great to be here, James.
Thanks so much for finding the time for me. I know that running a nonprofit like yours takes up a fair bit of time, and it's the summer, so you probably would rather be relaxing, but thanks again. So first, tell me a bit about who you are, a very quick biography, and why you set up your organization.
Loti?
Well, I've been in Tryon now for about 10 years. I was an insurance geek, owned my own insurance brokerage firm, and when I moved to North Carolina from Florida, I knew I wanted to get back to nature and learn more about native plants and gardening, and so that's what brought me really to this beautiful place, was being out in nature.
And I've been in Tryon now since 2002. Moved down from the Asheville area. I'm a sculptor, have been many things before this, but I love the outdoors, I love nature, I love sculpting nature. So that's one thing that Loti and I share a passion in, is that we both love wildlife.
Now, Western North Carolina has some species that are found here more than other places, I know, but it's not like the African safari. Right? We're not talking about exotic megafauna for the most part, although red wolves, right? But why here? Why Tryon and Columbus and this whole part of Polk County?
Well, I think because we live here and we really want to expose kids to what we have in our backyards, in their neighborhoods. And, so we both ended up here by happenstance, and 9 years ago met at one of Dale's art shows down at Tryon Painters and Sculptors. And actually, if you have been by the fountain in downtown Tryon, you'll see Dale's sculpture in the fountain, which is two doves on a railroad tie. And so...
Called Tales to Rails?
We met at the art show and got engaged in 8 days and then said, okay, now what are we going to do? So we knew we wanted to give back, and that's when we decided to get involved in wildlife conservation. And so since we live here, let's start in our own backyard and not fly to Africa to take care of the animals over there.
When most people think of a conservation organization, wildlife conservation, they think of Worldwide Fund for Nature, or maybe they think of Greenpeace or something, and they think, again, of these big animals or spectacular animals. I used to work for an organization called Project Seahorse, which used seahorses as a magnet animal to attract attention to the marine conservation, coral reefs, and that sort of thing. But that's not what you're doing, right? You're not saying, let's save these specific creatures or even these specific ecosystems. You're doing something that involves art and it involves young children. How did you come about to put all those pieces together?
Fascinating. It's been a long and meandering road. But when we first started out, it was a much more global perspective of saving wildlife, including some of the major players, African animals. And when the pandemic hit, Loti and I decided that we did not want to be doing international travel anymore. We did not want to be getting on planes. And then we realized, we don't have to go overseas to protect wildlife. We've got so many wonderful species right here that need help, and we can drive to them instead of having to fly to them. So that's when we decided to really concentrate on, let's look and see what we've got right here in the United States that we can help, that are under pressure, endangered, that need some public attention. And as for getting into children, that's a whole new story.
So as we started really in North Carolina with the red wolf, which used to live in Polk County, but it has been pretty much exterminated over the years through hunting. Now there's a small population of less than 20 over in eastern North Carolina, but the red wolf is the most endangered wild animal in the United States. And so we got known as sort of the red wolf people, and we were invited by Susan McHugh, a good friend of ours, to go in and meet Aaron Green and Ronette Dill. And that fateful day when we met Aaron and Ronette asked us a couple months later if we would come in and do a teacher orientation, just to tell teachers kind of what we knew about red wolves and wildlife. So we did that and had a small group of teachers who immediately came up to us after our talk and said, when can you come and teach my class? And we really hadn't considered, teaching kids. And so we went into third grade and we taught red wolves to 4 different third grade classes. And on our very first time teaching, I had a special ed, elementary ed background a million years ago, so I had some teaching experience. But on our very first third grade lesson, we got through talking about red wolves. The kids listened to them howling and told us how they felt. And the teacher came up to me, and every class we do now is about 15 to 20 minutes of talking about the animal in an interactive session with the kids, and then they have about 35 to 45 minutes of art. And in this case, they were sculpting red wolf heads from clay, and Dale was helping, and we had another volunteer. And the teacher came up to me with tears running down her face. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is our very first time teaching, and here we've upset the teacher. So I asked her, I said, what is the matter? And she said, do you see that little boy over there working with your husband? And I said, yeah. And the little boy had this big smile on his face. And she said, that is a nonverbal, autistic child who has never participated in an activity until today. And my heart melted. And I thought, this is it. Wildlife and kids and art is the magic combination. And nobody else that we have found is using that approach. And so fast forward 2 years, we've taught 6,500 children in Polk County and surrounding counties.
How long ago was that?
2 years ago.
Okay.
Time flies.
Well, that's remarkable. I mean, 6,500 kids, that's basically them all, right?
It's a lot of children, but I tell you, it is so rewarding for these kids they get excited learning about the animals, and They do their art project, and then they get to take it home. And one of the beauties that we didn't really expect is that they are then teaching their families about wildlife. And I got to tell you, you know, a dad or a mom who doesn't know about wildlife and I tell them about it, they may not listen. But their kid comes home and has a red wolf head or a hellbender out of clay or an owl made out of foil, they listen. And so I get stopped all the time going to the grocery store or wherever from parents going, my kid came home and now they love red wolves and they want to save them. How can we protect them? And so kids are really, you talk about curiosity, they are so engaged, and we're hitting the gifted kids, we're reaching the special needs kids, we're reaching the regular kid that doesn't even maybe have a backyard. They might live in an apartment. So it's quite miraculous.
And it's really wonderful to see not just educating the children, but empowering them. And that's something that we didn't realize how powerful that was going to be, that these children have this curiosity. They want to get involved. They want to help wildlife. They want to save nature, but they don't know how to do it. And we try to give them ways that they can do that. By talking to family members, their parents, their friends, showing off their artwork, telling people about animals that they might not be aware of. So it's seeing how these children, given a little opportunity and a little guidance, run with it. Whereas parents wouldn't be as quick to move as these kids. And it gives Loti and myself a whole bunch of hope.
And all of our volunteers, and I want to make it clear, we're not trying to turn kids into like activists, like Greenpeace. You know, we're trying to show them ways that they can be advocates. And I think that's an important, like, how can we, like Dale today went to do our recycling this morning, and he came home and he goes, guess what I did on the way home? And I said, what? And he said, I saved a box turtle. And I said, wow, where was it? He said it was on Warrior Road, and it was right in the middle on the double yellow line, and I stopped the car behind me, and I got out, and I helped it to the side of the road. Kids are like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. You know, so they can influence their parents, like, don't run over the turtle. Let's stop and let's save it, because they help disperse seeds. They help the environment, and they're so beautiful.
I know I actually saw a Facebook post from a friend of mine this morning who was telling exactly the same story about saving an eastern box turtle from crossing the road and probably getting run over, you know. And I actually have seen the remains of turtles that have been run over, because not everyone's going to see them. Let's talk about other species, though. I mean, you talked about the red wolf. The hellbender, I know the Mountain True, which is our umbrella organization for environmental conservation in this part of the world, uses the hellbender as like their feature species, kind of to attract attention. What other species should we be thinking about? What do you introduce kids to?
Well, we do a variety, because I could make the case that all species are under pressure right now. I mean, all wildlife is losing habitat. So we talk about gray foxes. We had a gray fox family live under Dale's art studio with 4 kits. And so we have great video, and kids love kits and pups and, you know, baby animals. We talk about possums. We talk about vultures, which is one of our very favorite. And people go, well, wait, you know, they're ugly and we hate them, and they you know, come around when there's something dead. And we let kids know that, hey, those vultures are like our vacuum cleaner for the planet. And without those, you know, you're going to have anthrax and botulism and all sorts of nasty diseases living on these dead animals. And the vultures clean that up for us. Plus, the really cool thing, and kids love this, is when you talk about vultures, in order to keep cool, they poop on their legs. And one thing I've learned about kids is if you use poop or butts, you got them.
You've got their attention.
That is like the 2 things. So pooping on their legs is really cool to kids. And the other thing is when a vulture gets scared, they projectile vomit, which is also really cool. So I've had adults go, really? I didn't know that, but now I'm going to pay more attention. So we do vultures. Bog turtles are critically endangered, and we have one of the only populations in western North Carolina, and they are like the cutest little turtle you've ever seen.
And don't forget pollinators.
And probably the most important, of course, is pollinators. We do a lot on pollinators, and last fall we actually had a class of 60 fifth graders at Polk Central Elementary, and we did 6 lessons with the teacher and the kids on how to design a pollinator garden and what pollinators we wanted to attract with which plants. And we actually planted a pollinator garden with 130 plants in it that we had donated by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Conserving Carolina. We had over 20 volunteers come out, and and the garden right now, we were just out there last week, it is gorgeous. And the kids are out looking at the bugs and drawing them in their nature journals. So we're going to plant another fall garden at Louder Pond next to the middle school with the middle school class this coming fall.
Now, I'm willing to bet that most people listening to this episode, if you said name a pollinator, they go, well, honeybee, and maybe if they're lucky, a hummingbird. But I happen to know, because I have a degree in biology, that there's a whole whack of pollinators out there. So what do you tell the kids? How do you introduce this notion of pollinators? Because it's so critically important to everything.
Well, we talk a lot about bees, for example, because honeybees, most people aren't aware, they're actually not native. They're from Europe. And yes, they are our state insect, which I don't really understand. But we talk about bumblebees. We talk about the dreaded carpenter bee, which turns out to be one of the best pollinators for milkweed, which is the only plant that monarchs will lay their eggs on. The cool thing that we do, and we kind of learned this again by chance, is we have what's called our Dead Bug Society. And membership in our Dead Bug Society is 10 dead bugs.
Which you can't kill.
Which you can't kill. You have to give them to us after they've already expired. So we have butterflies, we have moths, we have beetles, we have native bees, all sorts of things that pollinate. And the kids get to actually hold these little insects in their hands. And one story that I tell often is we had a little boy who was supposedly nonverbal to adults. And so he talked to his friends when we were in his class, and he said, I like to stomp on bugs in my backyard. And so we did. Our lesson that day happened to be on pollinators. And at the end of the class, they got to hold bees. And you could see this little boy just looking at this bee. And 2 weeks later, we came back in, and we were doing monarch butterflies, the migration to Mexico. And he came up to us. Now, again, he's supposed to be nonverbal to adults. And he said, I saved a bee. And I went, you did? How did you do that? He said, well, it was drowning in the bird bath. And so I went out and I scooped it up with my hands and I put it on the ground so it could dry. And then I went and got a rock. And I said, okay.
Doesn't
and
sound good.
This doesn't sound good. And he said, and I put the rock in the bird bath so that the rest of the insects and bees would have a place to land and not drown. Oh my goodness, you talk about heart melting. So taking dead bugs into the classroom is transformative. So we talked about all the different ways that pollinators pollinate.
And as you had mentioned, James, it is, most people think bees. They don't realize how many different pollinators are out there. Raccoons, possums, bears, all pollinate in a way where they are rubbing up against plants and they are pulling seeds from the plants and moving them elsewhere. So it's fascinating how many different elements are involved in this. And that's one thing that we do try to impress with the children, is that we all are working in concert with one another, and everything has a purpose. And even the most inconspicuous species out there are important, and everything ties together.
Well, I think that interconnectedness is one of the critical things we teach kids. And again, most kids, most adults don't understand the relevance of native plants with pollinators. So, native plants are necessary in order to have pollinators. And for example, most baby birds only eat caterpillars. And So most caterpillars only eat native plants. 95% of a caterpillar's diet are native plants. So coneflowers and goldenrod and all those things that milkweed. And without the native plants, you don't have caterpillars. And without the caterpillars, you don't have any baby birds. And you tell that to kids, and kids are like, oh, but I want the baby birds to live. And I said, well, go home and let's plant some native plants. Let's talk to your parents about, even if you plant one native plant in your yard, that's a start. That's an easy way to help.
How deep can you get into fundamental biology with you're mostly elementary students?
We teach K through 8th grade.
Okay. So, younger kids, and it's often difficult to deal with some of the fundamental issues, like when you talk about the relationship between flowering plants and pollinators, like which came first, right? You go back a few 100 million years, and scientists haven't really figured out how they co-evolved, because one had to come first. But you can't have flowering plants without pollinators, and these pollinators aren't going to have anything to feed on if you don't have flowering plants. It's tricky. So how do you deal with those tricky questions that really require almost graduate level research issues to resolve?
Well, when you've got a bunch of second graders or fourth graders, you really don't go down that road. You keep it really basic. We try to have the kids, think about, okay, even explaining to a second grader what's the difference between a native plant and a invasive exotic plant. And that's tricky. But we try to keep it really basic. Native plants are these kind of plants. Pollinators use these kinds of plants. Caterpillars only grow on these kinds of plants. And so for the kids, they don't really care which came first. They want to know that their baby birds are going to be around. And how do they save those?
But you still want to inculcate a sense of wonder and curiosity about the natural world, right? Which
is why we try to use in the classroom, we use a lot of video clips of pollinators flying, and we'll take just very, very short clips. That's why we take dead bugs in. You talk about wonder in a child's eyes. They hold a Luna moth, and then they learn that a Luna moth doesn't have a mouth, and so they don't eat the whole time they're alive. All of a sudden the kid is like, wow, I want to go outside. The other thing we're doing is we started a program this past year. We got a grant from the Rotary Foundation to buy some backpacks. And that has also been transformative in that we give a group of children, 4 kids, a backpack, and they have binoculars and they have trail guides and tracks, animal tracks.
Eyepieces.
Little eyepieces that magnify. And we take the kids outside. And that is our most popular course right now. We take them out in the schoolyard. They get their backpacks. They all get a nature journal that they get to take home. And they draw these, bugs that they find, or they're like the first time we went out at Saluda, we did not get, I think it took us 30 minutes to get 10 feet. The kids were so excited. They had their heads stuck in logs looking for, bugs and mushrooms. And that's how you do that wonder, is you get them outside. And when you give them a nature journal that's their very own, these kids are bringing them now to recess and saying, well, I'm going to take it home. I'm going to get all my backyard, nature. I'm going to start a shelf that I collect nature things. I'm going to draw in it during recess. It's pretty cool.
Well, that brings me to the thing that really fascinates me about your organization and your mission, and that is to make up for what is a gap in our institutional educational system, right? I mean, obviously, what you're doing, every kid in every school should be doing, but you can't do everything these days. And as technology advances, you have to introduce more things into the classroom, and therefore something else has to be pushed to the side. Do you do any kind of advocacy with the schools to try to get some of your instructive techniques into the school so you don't have to do it all? Or is that asking too much?
It's a great question. We meet with teachers, and with the pollinator for garden, for example, we develop these lesson plans, and we'll leave the lesson plans with the teachers, and also the teachers now are asking for some follow-up activities. So that's one thing that we can do. We also recognize right now we can only reach kids in western North Carolina. Specifically, Polk County is where we do most of our teaching. So we are in the process of early stage development of what we're calling a Kids Corner, a discovery den, where parents and kids will be able to go to a safe place on our website, download art activities that are wildlife related, download games that families can play together, coloring sheets of animals, steps that kids can do. So we see that as kind of an adjunct to what we're doing in the classroom.
Do you have any connection with parents who are homeschooling?
We really haven't had the capacity to actually teach homeschooling. We have been offering some free events this summer thanks to the Polk County Community Foundation, and we had a Hellbender event in May where we had Rocky, the live Hellbender, come. North Carolina Resource brought Rocky, and the kids got to touch it, as did the parents, which was interesting because the parents were more leery of touching it. And a lot of the people that came to that were homeschool kids, and they have asked us, can we, teach their homeschoolers? And right now, we just have not had the capacity. We have a full-time teacher, and we're looking for a second teacher. And our second event, we did nature walks out at the Looking Glass Creamery, and again, we had a large group of the folks that came were homeschooled. So we're touching them, but we're not reaching them to the extent we would like to.
I just wanted to add one thing to what Loti was saying, that with the launch of this Discovery Den, which will be accessible to people outside this area that we're living in, is going to give that opportunity to other children and their families to learn about wildlife and to be able to have art projects. And it's a way to extend this much further than we've been able to do this. And the beauty of working with one of the best school systems in North Carolina is we are developing programs that eventually, and art projects that we'll be able to put on our website that we will be able to offer nationwide, which is going to be wonderful. So it's a combination of working locally, but also making this available on a much broader scale.
Do you know of any other organizations across the country who are in a similar vein?
Not exactly using the art. That's, again, our secret sauce. You have, the National Wildlife Federation, who's got their Ranger Rick, and you've got National Geographic for kids. You've got Muddy Sneakers that gets kids outdoors. So there are organizations, but none of them that we have found are using art specifically. So again, every lesson has art. And the cool thing is we're starting to videotape now, like Dale, as a sculptor, does a 10-minute presentation of how to sculpt a red wolf head. So any child could sit down with that and figure out how to sculpt that head. We just had a very talented artist up in Hendersonville who did a session on quilling, which I didn't know what quilling was. Until
what is it?
Quilling is where you use the little circles of colored paper to make objects, little ribbons, and monarch butterflies, and you can make all sorts of wildlife with it. It's a really, really cool ancient art. But we had an artist talk about how to do quilling, and she shows the kids, so any kid could sit down and learn how to quill. So we've got a lot of ideas and a lot of plans coming up.
How do you finance these ambitious plans?
Well, with teaching 6,500 kids, everything we do is free. All of the supplies are taken into the school. We have been very fortunate to have the public schools in Polk County, Aaron Green specifically, supporting us by getting some grants through the Forbes Foundation and the 21st Century. We've gotten grants from the Polk Community Foundation. We've just gotten a grant from the Carolina Foothills Foundation, and we also need individual donors. Only 30% of our funding comes from grants. And, I had somebody last week say, oh, gosh, I read about all your great programs. I didn't realize you guys have to actually raise money for those programs. And I said, yeah, we do. So it's donors. We've got some corporate sponsors. Kelly Moving and Main Street Insurance both sponsor us in Polk County. We're looking for more corporate sponsors. So it's quite daunting.
Well, I'll make sure to put a link to your website on the show notes for this episode. I assume they can donate through there.
Absolutely. There's a big donate button up in the right-hand corner, and we would welcome any and all donations. The other thing that really helps us is our volunteers, because we don't have to go outside and pay our helpers in the school. So we always go into a class with at least 2, maybe 4 volunteers, and that has really been helpful. We've gotten a lot of in-kind donations from artists, material supplies have been donated in kind.
You might want to talk about what these volunteers are doing, that it's not a major undertaking.
Right. Well, the volunteers go in and help the kids with their art, which is really, really fun for the volunteers. In fact, we had somebody just a couple weeks ago say, I went in and they did the nature in your backyard, so they were outside with the backpacks. She said, that is the most fun I've had ever working with kids in Polk County.
When I first thought about doing this episode, I was thinking, because I have some education in biology, I thought, well, maybe it's the nature of our county that attracted you to this place and to do this. But then I realized, no, we've got a really strong artistic community here, too. I mean, both Saluda and Tryon are basically chock-a-block full of artists, right? So do you think you could have done this somewhere without a strong artistic community?
We could have, but it would have been a lot bigger challenge for a community to embrace art as much as it has. And you brought up a very interesting point earlier about how do we reach kids? How much information do we give them? And based on their age group, that will vary. But what we find is art is universal. Art will reach every age, and children will engage in art much more readily than they will absorb facts and figures. So we don't try to put too much information in front of them. We just try to give them a path. But more importantly, we try to get them curious and want to know more. And we find that art is a way to pique that curiosity. It really engages the kids. So if nothing else, we want them to just become more aware and then more curious about these things that they're seeing outdoors, and using their books that we give them, their nature journals, to record that and to draw it and create art as a way of learning.
The other thing I would say is, because of the art community, that's the reason Dale and I met, because I went to his art show at Tryon Painters and Sculptors.
Best show I ever had.
Without that show, we never would have met, so we probably wouldn't be doing this. So that art community, showed up in some different, interesting ways.
And it kind of dovetails with this notion that you are not professional science educators, right? So you're really not trying to talk to them about how evolution works or how ecosystem dynamics require mid-size organisms and habitats and all that kind of detail. You're just trying to make them fascinated with nature, right?
Exactly. And so we use terms like, there's pollen on the bee butt. When I use that term, a little second grader looked at me, he goes, you can't say that word. And I said, why not? He goes, because it's a potty word. And I went, oh no, well, I guess we won't say that. And I went up to the teacher afterwards and I said, I guess I said a potty word. And she said, oh, don't worry about it. They were all talking about their butts this morning, so I told them it was a potty word. So we don't use really big terms. We talk about the pollen on the wings and the pollen on the butt, and that they brush it off on the flower. So you don't have to be a scientist or a biologist or even an artist to help us teach our programs. I've got a special ed degree, but I haven't taught in over 40 years, so things have changed quite a bit. Anybody can go into the classroom with us, and as long as they like kids. If you don't like kids, then this is not a place to volunteer.
And wildlife.
Right. Wildlife, art, and kids. That's our secret sauce. And again, nobody that we have found is doing that anywhere.
Okay, here's a tricky question, because it comes back from my experience working with a conservation nonprofit. Metrics, measuring success, measuring outcomes, because quite often funders want to know. They want to be able to see, well, what does success mean? How am I going to know whether these dollars I'm giving you are being put to good use? So you haven't been around for that long, so you don't have this long record that you can point to. do you keep in touch with the schools and the teachers to find out if there's been any effect? Like, how do you measure your success rate?
Well, measuring right now is very tricky because there's, some new laws that have been passed about what you can and can't test kids on, and they're all over-tested anyway. So what we do is, obviously, we measure things like how many kids we taught, what grades did we teach. We also have every teacher after the class fill out a survey, and they rate our teaching, how they felt the kids engaged, the art program on a scale of 1 to 5. So far, we have all 5s out of 5s from every single teacher. Once in a while, we'll get a suggestion, but the teachers love what we're doing. So other than doing a survey kind of before a class and after a class to a child of how much do you know about gray foxes before the class, and then after the class, how much do you know, and then do you want to protect them? That's about all we can do because, we don't want the kids to think, oh gosh, here they come, they're going to, test us today. We want them to go, oh my goodness, Champions for Wildlife they're coming today. And that's what the teachers tell us. When they tell their kids we're coming in that day, is they get so excited because we also do an after-school program with the Polk County schools. So we're in each elementary school once a month, and we're in the middle school twice a month. And so, we even get those teachers to do surveys on us.
This question of metrics really is a tough one. We look at ourselves as basically planting seeds. And it might not germinate right away, but it's going to start that initial curiosity. So many of the young adults that we have met in the conservation field, when we asked them what got them excited about getting into that field of work, they said, well, when I was in elementary school or when I was a very, very young child, I had this experience. And that was the seed, and that's what everything grew from. So what we're hoping is just to plant some seeds. But there are things that kids are already doing. For example, a couple classes, the children have actually made books of specific species. A hellbender. They did one on, was it the red wolf or was it?
They just did one on box turtles.
Where the children actually drew pictures, they actually created art, and then they wrote short stories about a specific animal and printed it. And then made it available. So they're actually doing something. And we're hoping that it's going to empower more kids to say, hey, we have a voice, but this is going to be a long, long road. We're just getting these kids excited about wanting to learn more.
I think that we can all agree kids are over-tested. I mean, some schools are spending 25% of their time testing kids, which doesn't leave a lot of time to actually learn anything, in my opinion. But I understand why tests are important. But so you're about giving kids experiences rather than giving them knowledge. Is that a fair way to say it?
I think that's a fair way to say it. We're about introducing them to art forms that a lot of them have never been introduced to. So a lot of kids have never touched clay, for example. We're introducing them to the concept of what is a box turtle, and the fact that box turtles might live for 50 years and they only go a mile from where they're born. And so if you take a box turtle home and you return it somewhere else, they're going to spend their whole life trying to get back home. And kids are like, I had no idea. So it's introducing the kids to just, what happens, what's the consequences of some of the actions, and how can they stop those consequences.
So we can slip some knowledge in there.
Absolutely.
Right. But the main thing is for them to develop a connection with the natural world and a sense of wonder and awe and just plain old fun. Right?
Exactly.
And it's just amazing as these kids look at the bees and dead bees, and if the wing falls off, who cares? But they've all of a sudden held a bee and realized it's not going to sting me. It's not, if I go out, there are a lot of kids that are afraid to go in the woods because they've never been. And so if somebody's afraid, we'll hold their hand and we'll talk about the things we might see. And I had one little girl that said, I can't go in the woods. I'm not allowed to. And I said, well, hold my hand and, we'll just walk through this field, and we found a Luna moth. And her whole demeanor completely changed. So if we can give them a little bit of knowledge, keep in mind, a second, fifth grader, even an eighth grader, a little bit of knowledge to where they're curious, and they get to do some kind of art, which maybe they've never done before, and they get to take it home, and they get to talk to their parents about it or their siblings. We had one little boy that said, "Do I get to take my hellbender home?" He did a clay hellbender. And we said, "Yeah, you do." And he goes, "Awesome, I'm going to take it home and teach my big sister about hellbenders, and I'm going to give it to her to take to college." Now, that's cool.
That is very cool.
So that's what we do, is we just, like Dale said, we want to inspire and empower kids to be curious. We like the expression, the more you learn, the more you love, the more you protect. And if that's what we can do in the rest of our lives, then we've helped, who knows, one of those kids may grow up to be the next Jane Goodall, or one of those kids may grow up to figure out a way to clean all of our streams up through science. Who knows?
What about one of them growing up to do what you're doing? I mean, because let's face it, there's plenty of people who set up 501c3s, and they do some good work, and then they're done because they're too old. This is like a third act for you or something, right?
Right. We met in our 60s, and as I said earlier, we got engaged in 8 days. So we started a nonprofit. Dale will be 77 this summer. I'll be 70. So we started a nonprofit, really late in life, and people are like, "What are you doing?" But it has brought us so much joy, and we can see what we're doing. That's having power, and this is what we're going to do till they put us in the ground.
Well, my question is, though, are you laying a foundation that someone else can take over for you? So this,
Yes.
Yes, we have a full-time teacher, we have an associate director, we have a great group of volunteers, and we are
A great board.
And so we definitely want this to go on long, long after we are gone. So we are hiring people that have the same passion that we do, and they'll be able to take it forward.
All right. Well, I, for one, appreciate what you're trying to do, because I have watched children lose their sense of wonder about the natural world as they grow older, because I really do think they're born with it innately. And our schools just are tasked with doing so many things. So many things that aren't even related to education these days. There's kind of a social glue, or a safety net, or a safe place, and almost asking them to do something like develop a sense of wonder about nature, it seems to almost be too pie in the sky. So thanks.
Well, you're welcome. And, the teachers, it's a voluntary. They don't have to have us come in their classroom. But most of the teachers have gotten so comfortable with us that, they're like, "Oh, wow, I've got an hour. I don't have to plan the lesson. I know they're coming in. They're bringing all the materials. They're really organized."
And they're keeping the students engaged.
So thank you for your thank you.
Thank you, James.
All right. Well, we've all thanked each other. That'll be it for this episode. And I will continue paying attention to champions. So,
thanks again.
That's it for this episode. I'm going to take the next couple of months off to prepare for a series of interviews with candidates for public office in what I think is going to be the most important election of our time. In the meantime, any suggestions or feedback, you can send them to jamesh@polklore.com. Thanks for listening.